I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME and ASMIA, and it is my pleasure and privilege to once again welcome you all to our webinar series show. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend Yaakov Katz. And Yaakov will be talking to us about his latest book entitled While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. Very telling subject line and a very realistic one, given the reality that we know today, post 10/7. There is much to discuss. Yaakov has been a long time commentator and a journalist on these very issues. He spent time at the Jerusalem Post as the editor-in-chief, and he's now a contributing columnist, and he's currently now with a fellow, with the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. It's a mouthful there. Try not to like how many P's in one acronym. But Yaakov has a lot to say on these topics and has been a great observer and commentator on these very issues, and it is worthwhile to listen to what he has to say. So some housekeeping issues. Yaakov will talk for about 30 minutes or so, then we'll go into Q&A, and then we will do our best to get to all your questions as they come in. If we don't, I apologize in advance. Please feel free to email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. Furthermore, I'm also giving a plug for the book, which is behind Yaakov there, which is worthy of note, as well as MIA SPME members. We are going to offer a special 20% discount to the book that will officially be coming out in September, but we're going to get copies. And if you email us after the webinar and want a copy of the book, or come to our conference in November, we'll be selling copies of the book. You'll have that opportunity as well, and please communicate that to us as well. So really, without further ado, Yaakov, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Asaf, and thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to meet with everybody here and talk a bit about the book, but also just in general of what's happening right now, I think, here in Israel, because there's no doubt that the current situation remains no less tense, I would say, today than it was just a few months ago. And the standoff, which is hard to believe, I think that most Israelis and probably observers from around the world almost now 2 years ago would not have imagined on October 7th, 2023, that such a long time afterwards, we would still be bogged down in Gaza. We would still be fighting with Hamas, a terrorist organization that, let's face it, was Israel's supposed weakest enemy, and was the enemy that was supposed to have been the easiest one for Israel to potentially defeat, the easiest one to potentially contain. But I think what we have seen in now nearly 2 years since, we're coming up just now 4 months away from the second anniversary of the October 7th attack, is that this was definitely not the case. And while we even look to the north, to Hezbollah, where Israel dealt a severe blow to the organization with the walkie-talkie / beeper attack, with the targeted assassinations and killings of top leadership like Hassan Nasrallah, his successor, and then his successor's successor, as well as other many top leaders, dealing what was definitely a strategic blow to the organization, we've yet to really see that same level of success in Gaza. And I think that it really ties into the not just the slumber, if I could call it that, or the blindness that Israel went into or was caught when Hamas did invade the country on October 7th at 6:29 a.m. on that day, but also to the complete lack of preparedness that the Israeli government had when considering what would happen one day if such a war would break out and if such a conflict would break out. And when you think about it, though, and if we go back in time and we think historically, see, in the book, what we do is we look, of course, at the 48 hours preceding. And that's, a lot of people would want to get caught up on that. For example, how the defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, a former commander of what's known as Shayetet Shloshesrei, the 13th Flotilla, which is the equivalent of the U.S. Navy SEALs, was the commander of the Southern Command back in 08-09 during Operation Cast Lead, probably the first big operation into Gaza after the 2005 unilateral withdrawal known as the disengagement. He's the defense minister. He's wearing spandex biking clothes on that Saturday morning on October 7th, lives up north in a very nice home in a village called Amikam in northern Israel, and gets a phone call from his daughter, who lives in Tel Aviv, like a lot of young people like to. And I'm in Jerusalem because I'm already a little older, lived in Tel Aviv when I was younger. And she calls him up and says, Dad, there are rocket sirens in Tel Aviv. Because he doesn't hear them where he lives. He calls up the chief of staff at the time, Herzi Halevi, on WhatsApp on his phone and says, what's going on? And Herzi Halevi says, yeah, we're under attack. You probably want to get down to the Kiryat, the military headquarters in Tel Aviv. Herzi Halevi, together with the head of the Shabak and other senior officers, the head of the Southern Command, and other officers had been for 36 hours almost preceding, had been fielding phone calls and reading different intelligence assessments and reports. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, had no clue that any of this was going on. But even those who knew completely misread what was happening, what was Hamas preparing, because all of this really came back to this belief that Israel had. And if you think about it and you go back to the disengagement from Gaza, when Israel pulled out in 2005, the belief at the time was that Hamas was this second-tier type of terrorist group, was a group that could, at the most, fire some rockets, at the most, launch a small-scale incursion into Israel, try to kidnap someone. They did that, remember, in 2006 when they abducted Gilad Shalit, the IDF soldier who was deployed in a tank along that border. They could occasionally pop out of other tunnels, but likely only during larger scale operations like what we saw in 2014 during what was called Operation Protective Edge, when Hamas first began to use the tunnels, at least the cross-border tunnels, so successfully, motivating Israel to invest billions, literally billions of shekels, over $1 billion, in erecting what they called, we have the Iron Dome, right, the rocket missile defense system, but erecting what they called the Iron Wall, which was this underground barrier, meant an above ground barrier, 3 different layers of barbed wire, electronic fence, concrete slabs, you name it, remote control guns, radar systems, all there to stop anyone from crossing in. And then thousands crossed in on October 7th. But again, when we think back to what this was all about, there was a belief in Israel that these were rounds of violence that Israel would face, and we saw that every 2 years or so, Israel had a conflict with Hamas in Gaza. We saw that was ever since the pullout from Gaza in 2005. We had the Operation 08-09. We had Pillar of Defense in 2012. We had Protective Edge in 2014. And then we started to have smaller scale operations, right? In 2018, we had something called Black Belt. In 2019, we had another one. 2021 was a bit bigger, Guardian of the Walls. That was another operation when Hamas launched rockets on what's known as Jerusalem Day, the day that celebrates and marks the reunification of Jerusalem back in the Six-Day War of 1967. But there was never a belief that anything of this scale could happen. And here, in fact, it did. And so, therefore, when we look back now in almost 2 years, I think what we've seen is not just the misanalysis of the intelligence leading up to the invasion itself. We're seeing not only the lack of intelligence when it came to, for example, the tunnel infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but also the complete lack of preparedness with what do you do if ever, God forbid, there is to be a war like this? Because I think everybody on this call recognizes something that's very basic in any conflict. And unfortunately, I've covered too many in the last 25 years as a journalist in this country. But is that when there's a war, the military means, or the military operation is a means to achieve a much better and complementary political resolution to that conflict. Even if we go back to the original post-disengagement operation in Gaza, people tend to forget. But in 0809, in that first operation Cass led, which gave birth, if you recall, to the famous Goldstone report, which was probably the first report that came out against Israel, accusing it not of genocide just yet, but of war crimes and crimes against humanity already back in 2008, 2009, which Israel vehemently dismissed at the time. But then that operation ended with a U.S. mechanism that was supposed to be put in place to be able to prevent the smuggling of arms, as well as different, it was not a Security Council resolution at the time, but there was an international mechanism that was supposed to be put in place. If we go back to the 2006 Second Lebanon War, just a year and a half before that, you had a UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which ended that war. So Israel knew this, right? Israel knew that the military operation is only going to be as good as the political resolution that comes after. So how do we not have that today? And I think that now, looking at the full scope of this conflict, where I have to say the IDF, for the most part, in my opinion at least, has fought in an exemplary way, at least the soldiers, in the way that they've been operating on the ground in very tough conditions. And we could talk later, if you'd like, in the questions of why is talk about the casualty and death toll, which is highly, of course, controversial and also very painful, and to watch the tragedy that is unfolding in Gaza. But at the same time, where is the political arm to this conflict, and where is the political resolution? I fear and I feel, and of course I also do fear, that this is why we are dragging on in this war. And actually, if we think about where we are today, unfortunately, many Israelis have begun to ask, what is the purpose of the continued operation? But we could get to that in a moment. I do want to go back in time and talk about three elements and aspects of what I think led to October 7th. Of course, there was the intelligence that was coming in that 48 hours preceding. For example, how on Friday, they saw that SIM cards were being replaced in about 100 phones inside the Gaza Strip. So Israel, for example, the intelligence agencies have the ability to see when a Israeli SIM card is put into a phone inside the Gaza Strip, which, raises a lot of questions of what exactly does that mean. I guess it does mean that they know whenever a new SIM card goes into a phone. So that should have us all a little concerned about Big Brother watching, but we can understand why they would need to know that in Gaza. They see that 100 phones suddenly turn on and they have Israeli SIM cards in them. That would indicate, why would you need an Israeli SIM card in Gaza? The cellular towers are for the Palestinian network. It must mean that a potential incursion or infiltration is about to take place. And 100 phones is a lot of people. But then when they looked back at the intelligence, they saw that, for example, a year prior, on exactly that same day, they had tested also cell phones, a few less, not exactly 100, but also a significant number, several dozen. So was this something that was enough on its own to say to the IDF, you have to be prepared? Maybe not. When they started to notice, for example, and intercept phone calls that were being taken place between Hamas and Islamic Jihad members calling up their Hamas counterparts and saying, why are you uncovering rocket launchers, right? Those that are buried underground. Why are you preparing underground bunkers that are known to be used for the top Hamas leadership? For example, like Muhammad Def himself. He had a special bunker system. The military commander of Gaza, who has since been killed and eliminated in this war. But he had a special bunker complex for him and his family. We've seen, I'm sure many of you have seen these photos that have come out over the last now, 18 months or so, or 20 months or so, that show the different tunnel complexes, many variations, right? Very simple ones that are just for moving from point A to point B for low-ranking forces. Then there's ones that are used more for storage and command and control centers and for arms caches. And then there are ones that are, they're not, 5-star hotels, but they are of a higher caliber and better living conditions, bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms, showers. Those are ones that were established for the top leadership of Hamas. At some point, some of the hostages who were taken on October 7th did spend some time in some of those different tunnel complexes. Unfortunately, we know of cases of where hostages were killed in the really bad tunnels. So the stories that you hear, for example, sometimes of hostages who come back and talk about not having air to breathe, living in darkness, not having water, no ventilation. Those would be in the tunnels that are of a lower quality, but there were cases of hostages who were kept next to top Hamas commanders and nicer ones. Anyhow, Muhammad Def had one of those nicer tunnel complexes, and it was being prepared already on the 6th of October. And that raised also some questions. What is this being prepared for? And within the IDF and within the Shin Bet, the internal security agency, erupted a bit of an argument of what exactly is this? Is this Hamas preparing for an exercise, which would make sense? You would want to prepare and get your phones ready and uncover your rocket launchers and maybe prepare a bunker. Or was this Hamas actually preparing for some sort of invasion? And if they are preparing for an invasion, what is it going to look like? Is it going to be large scale, or is it going to be something medium or something even smaller? That's why, if I fast forward for a moment to the middle of the night on October 7th, the head of Shabak, Ronen Bar, sent a small squad of some of his special forces down to the border because in his mind, he felt that something might happen, but he thought it would be small scale. Maybe a couple of infiltrations at a few different points, nothing of the scale that we saw. The IDF, though, the prevailing assessment was that this was an exercise. And you even had phone calls that we gained access to what was said on them, of where the chief of staff of the IDF said to his subordinates, primarily the commander of the Southern Command, which is the regional unit or entity responsible for the Gaza Strip, said, don't do anything that will tip them off that we know that they're preparing something. Because of the intelligence and the way that things were collected, they were very genuinely concerned about burning the sources, some electronic and some human intelligence, although very few. And therefore, they felt that it would be better to play it safe, but not to do anything that would show them that we know that they might be doing something. And of course, Israel, we all know how that played out, paid the painful price. And when you read the story, I hope, what you'll see, and after writing it and reading it, you want to hit your head against the wall. Because of course, it's so easy now to think back and say, what if, we should have, we could have, we would have. But there were so many points along the way that things could have been different. But that's just in the 48 hours. Because the real question is, how did Israel reach a point that it believed in what I call a fairy tale? In Israel, in Hebrew, we use a word called misconceptia. I'm sure even those who don't know Hebrew on this call know what the word is, misconception. But what it refers to is something that happened back in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the war that broke out on Israel and the Jewish people's holiest day, the Day of Atonement, when the Syrians and the Egyptians together both invaded Israel from the north and from the south. Israel was just 6 years after its most brilliant war or military operation, when in 6 days, in the 6-day war, tripled in size and was high on itself, was arrogant, had hubris. And then 6 years later comes the Yom Kippur War, where they said, no, the Egyptians don't want war, the Syrians don't want war, and we had that misconception. I think more accurately to call it a fairy tale. How could Israel have believed that you can live alongside a genocidal terrorist group on your border that says it wants to kill you, that is building up a capability to do so, that says it's coming for you, and you say, no, you're not, you just want money. Let's get the Qataris to bring you $30 million a month. Oh, you don't really mean what you're saying, that you're coming to kill Israelis or Jews or abduct people. You just want workers to come into Israel. No problem. We'll let 15,000 people come in every day. We'll increase it to 20,000 people. That happened under the Bennett Lapid government, what was so-called the Change Coalition back in 21 and 22. There was a belief that that was the reality. So how did we reach this point that this was something that was even possible to believe in. And I think that it's even more of a question because you all as practitioners, I think, in this region and in the study of this region know that Israel's not a country that falls asleep at the wheel. Israel is ever vigilant, is over vigilant, is a country, the one and only that has ever bombed another country's nuclear reactor successfully twice, OC Iraq in 81, Al-Kibar in Syria in 2007. It's surrounded by enemies. It carries out some of the most brilliant operations and covert ops that we've ever seen in the history of military, I think definitely modern military history, whether Entebbe in 1976, Stuxnet in 2010, the stealing of the nuclear archives from Iran. And I could go on and on and on. But what happened here? How did the Israeli military not have that same vigilance? And I think that the reason at least I look at it like a fairy tale is because it was something that everyone believed in. And I think that if we all look into our own set of beliefs on a personal level, God or whatever else that we believe in, we know that you can rationalize anything and that whatever you see, you can interpret according to what you believe. And that's what happened here. There was a policy that was set that led to this understanding that this is what they want. And as a result, everything was looked at through that prism. I want to highlight, though, two elements. I want to be cognizant of the time and give time for questions. I mentioned before the tunnels, just to give you the sense of how deep the rot was in terms of our understanding of what was really happening in Gaza. We go back again to 2021. You might remember at the time that in this Operation Guardian of the Walls, Israel bombed what it called the Metro. It spoke about this unprecedented, sophisticated network of tunnels that ran through Gaza. They named it the Metro after, subway systems. They said that this is what it was like, almost the scale of it. But Israel carried out this meticulous bombing operation where they planned for months, gathered the intelligence over a year, chose the coordinates super carefully, synchronized operation, but to hit the tunnel on angles and with the right munitions so not to capsize and bring down civilian structures and apartment buildings that were up above. And they declared victory. And the chief of staff at the time, Aviv Kochavi, and the prime minister at the time, Netanyahu, said, we denied and destroyed for Hamas one of their most strategic assets. Now, fast forward to 2023, we discovered that we knew we didn't hit anything in 2021. We maybe hit a tiny fraction, maybe 1% of their tunnels, 5% of their tunnels, nothing. We went into Gaza, the IDF went into Gaza thinking that they maybe have a couple hundred kilometers of tunnels and discovered that they have hundreds of miles of tunnels. In the beginning of the war, or about half a year in, the IDF assessed that it had already succeeded in destroying 50% of the tunnels. Just a couple months ago, the IDF updated its assessment and spoke about how maybe they've been able to destroy by now, so over a year later, maybe about 40% of the tunnels, meaning 50, 60% is still left. How is that possible? Because we, Israel, did not collect intelligence on those tunnels that were in Gaza. Where did we put the focus on the tunnels? On the tunnels that crossed into Israel, on the so-called terror tunnels, the ones that could be used to invade Israel, to launch a so-called 9/11 attack against Israel, Israel's nightmare scenario. How many people, though, and that's where we invested the money, and that's where we invested the intelligence and the collection and the analysis, but I'm sure you all know by now, how many people crossed into Israel on October 7th through an underground tunnel? Not one, zero. They all crossed above ground. So why didn't we collect intelligence on the tunnels in Gaza? Because we never imagined that we would need to know where they are, that they would ever have 251 people that they would have taken, and some of them would be held in tunnels. And that's what happened. So in Israel's intelligence community, the belief about the tunnels was that this is something that, yeah, people like Mohammed Def, Yahya Sinwar, other top commanders of Hamas would use to go down into if and when there were to be an operation. That something like that would be their bomb shelter, would make it harder for Israel to reach them. But never would it be something that Israel has to carefully watch itself. What does it attack? Where does it go? Because we never thought that we would be fighting on the ground for such a sustained period of time. This was the blindness that Israel found itself in. And I want to mention one other element to this, and this has to do with the money. Israel, for a number of years, created a unit back in the mid-2010s, which was supposed to and was established to combat terror financing. And they did amazing operations. It was called Harpoon. And they went around the world and launched covert operations, sabotage, sometimes bombings, sometimes with kinetic means, sometimes using lawfare, activating legal battles and using lawyers in different countries to try to file lawsuits against different banks. If you look back, you might remember the Arab Bank or the Bank of China, different cases that came up over the years. And those were provided with a lot of intelligence from the Israeli intelligence agent community. But what ended up happening, and there was an understanding, I think we can all recognize that makes sense. Terrorism needs money, right? Plants need water. We need food. Terrorist activities require funding. If you can stop the funding, you can potentially undermine their ability to attack you, right? So just like you want to attack them with kinetic means, and just like you want to fight them at the Security Council and get condemnations and get them designated as a terrorist group, you also want to cut the flow of cash. But what ended up happening, and for years that's what Israel did, until we did the exact opposite. And that's where the Qatari scheme came into play, which was basically born out of the 2014 operation in Gaza, which was 51 days. At the time, seemed like forever. One of Israel's longest wars, longer than the Yom Kippur War. And Netanyahu really faced at the time a serious dilemma. How do I break the cycle that Israel found itself in? Every 2 years fighting these wars, 2009, 2012, 2014 again. How do we break the cycle? And that's where, and the Qataris stepped up, as they do often, as it seems, and using their money to buy influence and offered to help. And Israel saw an opportunity and thought that it too could buy quiet. And for a time it worked. But I think that has now shattered this idea of what exactly is possible with a group like Hamas, which I'll just end with then, after everything we've just said. What does this mean for the future? And I think that's where I'm mostly concerned, because I feel that when I think about Israel and I think about what it is that Israelis want the most, and after living here now for just over 30 years, I feel like I have some insight into it. I think what Israelis really want at the end of the day is the ability to live in peace and quiet. And because of that inherent desire, Israelis will be willing to once again try to contain an emerging threat. But the lesson of October 7th has to be that we don't allow that. So what is the lesson of October 7th? Is it that we have to from now on preempt and live by a policy of preemption, which is not something that Israel has ever done, really? If you look throughout Israeli history, Israel has used the policy of preemption only in 2 scenarios: nuclear, so Osirak and Al-Kibar, and the what was called the war between wars, when Israel launched this very sophisticated and sustained air campaign against what we called Iranian entrenchment in Syria. But otherwise, when we would see missiles moving to Gaza, or tunnels being dug in Lebanon, or 100,000 rockets coming to Lebanon. We never launched a preemptive strike or war against a conventional threat. Not in Israel's cards. We never launched a preemptive strike against Syria's massive stockpile of chemical weapons, which only had one purpose, to potentially be used one day against Israel. Till Assad, of course, used it against his own people. And the only reason Israel was able to do that so-called war between wars in Syria was because of the civil war in Syria and the understanding that there wouldn't be repercussions and consequences like in Lebanon, where Israel never touched, or like in Gaza, where Israel was always dealing with gloves. But what happens now? Is now the time for that preemptive policy and new doctrine? So the next time they see missiles moving, the next time they see a tunnel being dug, the next time they get those intelligence reports of rocket launchers being uncovered or tunnels being prepared for top commanders, does that mean you attack right away? Or do you again say, let's contain it. Let's write down where it is, but we don't want to go to war now. Schools are back, summer vacations upon us, whatever the excuse might be at that time. And that's the real dilemma. And as a result, when we finished working on the book, Amir and I, my co-author, we really felt that there is the real challenge is not just learning from the mistakes of the past, but also understanding how do we change how we are in the future. And I think that is the greatest challenge for any country, right? Any military will always face the challenge of how not to prepare for the next war just by learning the lessons of the past war, of the last war, but really from a governmental strategic policy. How does Israel move forward? And that is something that I have lots of thoughts about, but I think is a question that we don't yet know the answer to. So maybe with that, I'll stop. I've gone a little past my time, and be happy to take any questions from people.
All right. Yaakov, thank you for that extremely thorough description of really and the phenomenal research and thorough work you guys have both done to put this book together. And obviously, there are many questions, and you highlight all the issues that we're seeing today. There are a bunch of questions that I have. There are a bunch from the audience. But let me let me start us off by one first question, then I'll go to Alex, then we'll go to the audience. As far as where we are. So, to your last point, and as far as, where does Israel go from all of this? And, the question of the day after tomorrow that everybody is looking for an answer about. So with the internal investigations that are going into Israel about the conceptia and the deconceptia and everything else, what is the state of everything that's been played out here now, given the fact that the controller state, investigation and where that stands, the other investigation is a refusal of the government to look at some of these investigations. Obviously, after Yom Kippur, looking historically, there was a government investigation as far as looking at all of this. This all seems to be held up, and for obviously there are political reasons. There's the connectivity that lies into all of this. But give us a sense of where you are now, as a segue to your last point. Is where does Israel go forward from this? As far as these lessons learned, and how do we take all of that? And if you could also comment, and I know I'm adding a little bit more here. You touched on it during your comments. None of this came in a vacuum. And obviously the connection of what's happening now in the States and in Europe and to what's going on in Israel and vice versa. Touch on that as well, if you can, because I think that that's also relevant apropos your comments about Harpoon and all, and we can talk about that as well.
So thank you, Asaf. Personally, I think we definitely need a state commission of inquiry. We need a state commission of inquiry because there are some things that we of course, Amir and I weren't able to get access to. So much classified material to be able to we spoke with all the different relevant players, from the prime minister through the cabinet and the relevant commanders in the IDF and the leaders of the Shabak. But when a state commission of inquiry is doing this, this is a whole other level. So I think that we definitely need that, because we do have to learn the lessons. We have to see what went wrong. And it's not something that just a military can look at. Yes, there were mistakes that were made, and there need to be reforms within the intelligence agencies, and we get into some of that. By the way, I think there's a conversation that needs to be had in Israel today. Do we need to reform the structure of our intelligence agencies? One of the recommendations that we made is to consider, for example, the model of DNI, the Directorate of National Intelligence in the United States, which was born out of the disaster and the failures that led to 9/11, when I think there were 16 or 17 independent intelligence agencies, and understanding that you need to have one person who's overseeing the coordination and the flow of information, and how does everyone work cohesively, so, or holistically, the way you have it today in Israel. One of the lessons of Yom Kippur was that you need to have, or that war was, you need to have a table where all the heads of the services come together: Mossad, Shabak, military intelligence, the nuclear energy agency, the head of the research division at the foreign ministry, and they do gather. But we also know that the head of the Shabak and the Mossad is under the authority of the prime minister. The head of the military intelligence, Amman, as it's known by, is under the purview and the command of the IDF chief of staff, and of course the defense minister. And there have been numerous cases, I could tell you, of where the prime minister won't let the head of the Shabak come to a meeting with the head of with the defense minister and the head of the military intelligence, because just at that moment the defense minister and the prime minister aren't getting along. I mean, this doesn't make sense, right? We can't have situations like this. We can't have reality where the politics and personal vendettas are getting in the way of the flow of information and organizations working together. We've had over the years in Israel a different intelligence minister, which is always a convenient kind of, fig leaf to throw at some second-rate politician that the prime minister wanted to give a portfolio to, but made up something, but never given the authority. Again, those are the kind of things that someone really needs to dig into and look at what are the solutions for that. By the way, you mentioned the Agranat Committee that was established after the Yom Kippur War. Do you know when it was established? Within how many days? Within just a matter of weeks from when the ceasefire went into effect, did we already have a state-appointed commission of inquiry. So instead of having that now, we have the state comptroller who's doing his thing. We have the IDF that's doing their thing. But no, and we have fights of what exactly should we believe in a state commission of inquiry. Well, it's appointed by the Supreme Court. So now it falls into the whole judicial reform conversation. We can't trust. Half of the country doesn't trust the Supreme Court. Half of the country does trust the Supreme Court. We've already politicized the whole conversation. That's to our detriment. So I hope that we can find a way to really investigate this. And I think that we all know that because of politics, it is not moving forward. To the second part of what you asked about what we're seeing now across the world, if I understand correctly, just you mean like this tidal wave turn against Israel in Europe and around the world. Is that what you're referring to?
Sure, yeah. I mean that's the world we live in, and we're dealing with the consequences of that. And to that end, I mean, the world is now coming to terms, and with the reality that, of course, 10/7 did not come in a vacuum, and I think that Israel missed the boat on the issue of how much entangled the connection between Europe and Israel, Europe and the United States. It goes back into Gaza. There's
for sure. And I think, I think also the Qatari role that is played here, and how the Qataris have been given a pass by consecutive U.S. administrations and even by the Israelis, right? I mean, I tell in the book how is during that, talking about Harpoon or the different agents who were working on the financial counterterrorism operations, Qatar was off limits. Why? Because there were also relations. It's a complex relationship that Israel has had with the Qataris over the years. There was a lot that needs to change in that sense of how we understood the different map of this region and the interests of different players. But also, I think and you're seeing this across campuses in America, so you don't need me to tell you just how deep the tentacles, not just of the Qataris, not just of the Palestinian militant movements, how deep this all goes. But this was something that was not dealt with correctly for a long time.
Great, thank you for that. Alex, I'm going to let you ask your question, and then we'll go to the audience.
Sure. Again, thanks very much for a very stimulating and depressing presentation. I want to get to my question in a roundabout, but hopefully quick way. For the last 25 years or more, Israel has made a series of strategic economic military decisions, which the emphasis on special forces, the emphasis on high-tech intel operations, the emphasis on high-tech intelligence gathering, a small army with reduced armor, air power as the be-all and end-all. These are economic decisions which were justified as strategic decisions. These were strategic decisions that were justified on economic grounds, which led to certain kinds of capabilities and lack of capabilities. One of the things that I've found most striking and one of the most depressing things I've read in a very long time was an analysis by Yaniv Kubovich in Haaretz, which is a very granular breakdown of intelligence failures on October 6th, 7th, and beyond. Southern Command not talking to Jerusalem, observers being ignored, colonels berating captains, this horrific kind of cultural breakdown at a very granular level, in addition to what you were talking about in terms of terror financing being suddenly cut off, and then operations being cut off, and Qatar being compartmentalized after that. My question really is a cultural explanation, an overall cultural explanation why Israeli society, as embodied in the establishment, was so dysfunctional and so had such tunnel vision and had such granular kinds of failures in the moment, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue, and this is the main question. I think that you talk about, for example, what are known in Hebrew as the tatzpitaniot, the spotters or the surveillance soldiers. There were 5 of them who were taken hostage by Hamas. They were abducted from the Nahal Oz outpost, a military position along the border. 16 of them were massacred and murdered that day. And I'm sure many of you have seen the video that was uncovered and released eventually last May, showing what the Hamas terrorists who infiltrated their base, as they lined them up against a wall, talking about how beautiful they are, how they want to marry them, prostrating themselves, praying on the floor, and Allah Akbar, as they looked at these young female soldiers who were then taken to Gaza. And mind-blowing. And I shudder every time I think about it, as someone who has a daughter who's currently an officer in the IDF. But what they had warned all for months of changes along the border. Their job was to see when a mosquito would take off and fly along the fence. They saw intensified training. They saw more senior commanders coming to the border. They saw changes to the positions along the border. They alerted their commanders, who brushed them off. Why were they brushed off? So was it chauvinism? I don't think so necessarily, maybe a bit of it, but it was part of this culture. We know better. I myself, Alex, had been to briefings with the chief of staff months before October 7th, where we sat for 2.5 hours listening to assessments on Iran, Hezbollah, the Biden administration, what's going to happen with Saudis, how are our relations with the Emiratis post-Abraham Accords, and then at the last 5 minutes, oh yeah, Gaza, no, Hamas is deterred, everything's okay, right? I mean, where did that come from? You see them amassing weapons. You hear them declaring what they're declaring. How did we not understand that 2 and 2 equals 4, right? How did we miss that simple understanding? And I think that culture is something that will have to change, right? How did we fall into that trap? So there are different answers, right? You could say, well, we were hyper focused on Iran because that's the ultimate threat. Or we were played, we were fooled, we misunderstood. It was a tactical mistake, but it wasn't a strategic mistake. I mean, everyone tries to find that specific answer. There are those who still believe almost 2 years later that there was somebody inside who was a mole or a spy and undermined and did something, shut off some system. There's a lot of conspiracies that still go around. The prime minister's own son helps to spread them on social media, right? This comes from a failure to believe that, yeah, this was systematic or systemic. This was something that was all throughout all branches of government, military, and intelligence. And that's where we have to. So I come back to the fact that I think it stems from, like I mentioned, this desire to live and not to fight, and to postpone and push off that conflict for as long as possible. But that is something that therefore has to change now.
So it's a postmodern version of Yebeseder.
It's a more complicated version of Yebeseder.
Yeah,
exactly.
as it used to be.
It'll be okay, right?
There probably won't be a reckoning, and maybe it'll come or won't come, but it'll be all right.
Yes.
Okay.
We hope so. Let me take some answers. Let me take some questions from the audience and see, and then we can go back and see how that goes. So just going back to, we have a question about the findings of a state inquiry. If they are published, and this goes, how would that feed into Israel's enemies? Is that like an issue of, the Israel trying to, the transparency and accountability of internal stuff, or is there is there more like, something that we can, take those lessons learned, I guess, to, the question, and kind of like take on new military strategies while not exposing. I mean, part of the, the obviously, in which you talk about and written about as well, part of the reason that Hamas obviously had Israel's number was because, Israel was so embroiled in the judicial reform. They knew exactly what was going on. They had Netanyahu's number. They knew exactly how they were going to react, and obviously, led to all this failure. But what is a commission like, in contrast to the Granat commission that, Yom Kippur, in an age, of infotainment look like, where Israel can, adopt the Beseder in a postmodern world, but also, be introspective in that regard as far as taking things closely to heart?
No, I mean, Israel, I think at the end, if I look at October 7th, the way I view it today is a coin with two sides to it. There's the side of the failures that led to the disaster and the massacre, but there's the side of the re-engineering of the Middle East. And you see really that when facing a threat, the Israeli military machine, the military, the IDF itself, the intelligence agencies, have remarkable capabilities. I mean, we know about the qualitative military edge, QME, that Israel has, the technological advantage, the intelligence collection capabilities. So all very impressive, and look at what it was able to do, right? How do you bridge the gap between that beeper operation in Lebanon and not understanding that thousands of people are about to invade your country? We didn't have one agent on the ground among those 3,000 people who crossed in who could say, hey, we're coming now. Nobody was there. But we were able to get all of Hezbollah duped to carry around a beeper with explosives in it. How does that make sense? And I think that the lesson that I've taken away is where we weaken ourselves, that's where we cause the most damage. And Hamas recognized this, right? They saw what the judicial reform was doing to Israel. They saw the division within the country. They saw the country coming out of 5 elections in the span of 3.5 years. So they understood that there's an opportunity to do something that can drive that wedge or take advantage of it and catapult themselves to a higher level. But they also saw, and this we now know, is that the Saudi normalization was coming. And the Iranians, from intelligence, we also now know, wanted to torpedo that and wanted to try and prevent that from happening. And they have succeeded. Look at from where we were on the eve of October 7th to hearing MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, talk about how he's eager for normalization and no longer saying that we need Israel to, we need a two-state solution, or no longer even saying that we need Israel to commit to a two-state solution. We just need Israel to say that it's committed to something, some process. Where we've gone from there to where we are today, where it seems farther away, although I still believe and hope that if the war were to end, there is a prospect and a possibility. So they were very sophisticated, and they read Israel very carefully, and they have insight into Israel that I think we did not appreciate the quality of that insight into the way this country operates.
Great, thank you. Alex?
Yeah, it's interesting just to circle back to your initial point. There used to be this whole spate of books in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century about Israel as the Spartan society that was completely militarized, and that's still a kind of rhetorical tick that you see in lots of Western discussions of Israeli society. I read something today about universities as, the central locus of militarized, Israel. But the fact is that it's not militarized. It's a divided, often incredibly incompetent society that is trying to escape as much as possible the military responsibilities as this overbearing concept. But I think the last question I wanna ask is, and we've asked this of previous guests who've discussed October 7th. Israeli society is traumatized. Palestinian society is traumatized in other ways, let's say. How long until some kind of reconciliation can be effected and something like a peace process, the Holy Grail for the last 50 years of Western policy, can be actually restored? When will the two sides have enough confidence, respect, something?
Well, I think what first needs to happen is, beyond the war ending, we need to have recognition of the pain and suffering on the other side. I don't know that we have enough of that from the Palestinian side. I think we don't have enough of that on the Israeli side, which I can speak to, I think, with greater authority. I feel that here in Israel, we for too long, we felt that to recognize the tragedy that's unfolded in Gaza, to recognize the suffering in Gaza, is as if we're taking away from our own suffering, our own trauma, our own pain. I don't look at it that way. I think the two can exist side by side, unfortunately. That's the reality. I also think that we can recognize the tragedy and suffering on the other side, but explain it by saying this is Hamas who's responsible, right? What Israel is doing, the way it's fighting, I can't get into every operation because I don't have the insights into every bombing. But overall, when you look at this war, for the most part, the Israeli military has tried to fight in a way that we have never seen before in urban civilian settings, especially in a way like what we've seen in the Gaza Strip, with how embedded Hamas is within civilian infrastructure. But with that all said, so we can say it's not Hamas, but we should be able to say that that's happened. So I think we first have to have recognition. I think then we have to have a serious conversation of what is it that we want. Before we think about what it is that the world expects from us, Emmanuel Macron recognizing a Palestinian state will do nothing to advance the cause of a Palestinian state, right? The answer has to come from the people who live here. So the Palestinians, of course, they themselves want independence, but what is it that Israel wants? Because for the last 20 years or so, I don't think we have an answer. Now, if Israel were to decide it wants to apply Israeli law and annex Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, then it could have done that 100 times every day for the last few years, right? Netanyahu has the votes. Would not post-October 7th be the time to teach everyone a lesson and to annex the West Bank and the Israeli settlements that are there? You already have over 500,000. So why doesn't he do it? And if that's not what he wants to do, which clearly he does not want to do, because otherwise he would have done it, so what is it that he wants? Now, is the answer he just wants to not make a decision? That's what I think the answer is. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we're in. So we don't make a decision. We kick the can down the road. We have in Yiddish, there's the saying, nishta here, nishta hein, right? We're neither here nor there. So we're not annexing, but we're also not doing what it takes to potentially advance some sort of resolution, some sort of separation, whether we call it a two-state solution, or as Naftali Bennett refers to it, an autonomy on steroids, or whatever it is that this entity would look like. There's so much that we could be doing and they could be doing. They could be understanding that it doesn't happen when you sign a dotted line at the White House. Top down does not work. You need to build also bottom up. The Oslo Accords failed because of this belief in the top down approach. No, that's not enough. You need to also build and create a culture and de-radicalize and write the right textbooks and have the right media institutions and have the right cultural institutions and raise a generation that doesn't want to kill but wants to live. They didn't do that. But also Israel, what do we want? If we believe that that's the objective, which consecutive governments have, then there's a lot we could do on the way towards that. If Israel is the startup nation, as it likes to call itself, why are we not sharing that technology and innovation and ecosystem of a culture of creativity with our neighbors who live right there? So I think that ultimately that's where we need to go, but it will have to start with the recognition of the pain and suffering, with the decision of where we want to go, but with a very thorough process of de-radicalization that has to take place within the Palestinian Authority. And it has to take place, of course, in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Now, people, they have a generation of people who grew up wanting to kill me and my kids. How do we change that? My kids today, I had coffee today with a Palestinian friend in Jerusalem. My kids believe, some of my kids believe, and it pains me to hear them say this, they think that every Arab that they see is a potential murderer. They are traumatized by October 7th. I don't blame them. I don't blame either side right now. But I do have to think about how do we move forward. And I think that that has to come through a de-radicalization, more on the Palestinian side, but also to some extent on the Israeli side. It can happen. It takes time. It requires something that none of us in today's world have, which is called patience, and the ability to wait and see and understand that that's where we're going, but we have to take small steps to get there. So Alex, in short, I think it's possible, but it will require the right leadership to help lead us in that direction. It's not Netanyahu. It's not Mahmoud Abbas. I don't think it's not Hussein al-Sheikh, who's the new vice president of the Palestinian Authority either. And I don't know if it's Naftali Bennett, who's the chosen one here in Israel, because he's up in the polls right now. So I'm not sure who it is. I don't have that answer for you. But I do know that it does require a transition in leadership, a recognition on both sides, a healing that needs to take place on both sides, and big, brave decisions as well.
Right. That's a good way to end there, Yaakov, and thank you for that. Again, let me, our time has come to an end, unfortunately, but I do want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you for writing the book. I mean, obviously, I highly recommend it for everybody to read. It's a good, thorough read of unpeeling all of these critical issues that obviously are evergreen issues that are now eroded and are on steroids in a lot of ways. So hopefully you can come back, and talk to us again. But I want to thank you again. I want to thank the audience for joining us this afternoon, as always. I want to thank my colleague and friend Alex for co-hosting the event, today's show, as always, with me. And we will look forward to continuing the conversation. As always, to our audience, please look out for future webinars. Let us know if you want Yaakov's book, and we will talk soon. So thank you again. And Yaakov, you in Israel, it's already evening, so have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Take care.
Take care.